Welcome, everyone. Welcome. We've got a great audience here in person as well as a large number of attendees online for today's event. I'm Dan Murphy. I'm Executive Director of the Masaver Ramani Center for Business and Government, your home for all things business and government at Harvard, at HKS, and beyond. So if you're interested in today's event, I hope you'll take a chance to check out our website, follow us on LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter, check out our YouTube videos, and other things. Today's event is Latin America's economy, recent developments and prospects, and we have the perfect speaker to talk about this, Dr. Rodrigo Vergara. He was governor of the Central Bank of Chile between 2011 and 2016. Before that, he held various senior level roles at Chile's central bank. He's also done a variety of things in the policy sphere, including being an economic advisor to the central banks and governments of several countries in Latin America, Eastern Europe, Asia, and Africa. He's been an external consultant for the World Bank, the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the United Nations. I could go on, but I want to give him time to speak, so I won't read all of the parts of his illustrious career, except for to say that he also has held senior roles in academia as a professor, as an editor at important journals, and he holds a lengthy publication record. I'd like to think that Harvard and MRCBJ has played some small role in his success. After all, he does hold a PhD in economics from Harvard, and I'm proud to say that he's been a research fellow with us for many years and continues to hold that role. So we're thrilled to have him back to share on this really important topic. Dr. Vergara is going to speak for about 35 minutes. We'd ask that you hold your questions during that time, and when he's done, he'll take questions from the audience. With that, please join me in welcoming Rodrigo Vergara.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much to the Masaver Ramani Center for Business and Government. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you, talking about Latin America's economy, recent development, and prospects. So I remember some years ago, I came and I gave a talk about monetary policy in Latin America. I was just finishing my term. I had just finished my term as a governor of the Central Bank of Chile. So we talk about inflation targeting, monetary policy, inflation, etc. And naturally came up the issue of economic growth. And of course, at that moment, Latin American economy was not doing well, as it's been the case over the last many decades. But there was some optimism, at least some hope, I would say based on two grounds. The first, the usual problem of Latin America in the previous decades had been very irresponsible fiscal and monetary policy, macroeconomic policy. So huge budget deficits, monetary financing of deficits, inflation, current account deficits, crisis, and the usual boom and bust cycle. But at that time, let's say a decade ago, most, not all, of course, but most Latin American economies have made arrangements, institutional arrangements, to work that out. And at that moment, inflation was relatively low, fiscal was not perfect, but was improving, debt was not big. So there was ground for hope regarding this improvement in macroeconomic policies. Second, there was a handful of countries, among them my own country, Chile, that had done very well over the previous several years. In the case of Chile, actually, it has been 30 years of high economic growth, an average economic growth of 5%. But Chile had been joined by countries such as Peru and Colombia, to a lesser extent Mexico, that were performing relatively well. That was a relatively good period for Latin America, okay? In the period which is between, just before the global financial crisis and to some years after that. You have to remind that also that was a year with a commodity price boom. So there was hope that, in a way, the low-performing countries, or some low-performing countries, would join the high-performing countries, and the region as a whole would do better. What has happened since then? Just the opposite. The high-performing countries joined the low-performing countries, and the region as a whole has done extremely bad. You don't have now the sort of group of countries that were doing well some years ago. Chile's growth has been only 2% of the last decade, and something similar has happened with the other countries that were doing very well some years ago. So what has happened? Despite that there's been improvement in terms of macro policy, there's been a significant deterioration in terms of politics, institutions, and public policies in general terms. And the whole region as a whole is not doing well. And let me just mention a single point. When I say the whole region as a whole, I'm talking about averages. Of course, Latin America has many countries, so you can always find one or two countries here and there, particularly small countries that are doing better. But the major economies of the region are not doing well, none of them. Some of them, some were better, some of them, some were worse, but not good at all. So let me start with some context. Here you see Latin America's share of world GDP. And what we see, it's been declining over the last, here we have over the last 40, 45 years. Back in 1980, Latin America, and this is the blue line, represented more than 12% of global GDP. What is now? Only slightly above 7%. But of course, you can say, well, I mean, this is China. I mean, China has grown very high. It's gained share of GDP. Now it's the second largest economy of the world. So it's only natural that other economies lose share in terms of world GDP. But even if you exclude China, this is the red line, the orange line, you see a significant decline of Latin America. Of course, less pronounced, but you see still a significant decline in Latin America as a share of world GDP. And you see different periods here. In the 1990s, the decline was very pronounced. This is the well-known lost decade. Then the 90s, some decline, but not that much. And then you see this period here, which was the period I was talking about, in which Latin America did relatively well. But then again, the last decade has been pretty bad in terms of economic performance. When you see per capita GDP as percentage of world's per capita GDP, you see a similar picture. Latin America used to have a per capita GDP above world's GDP until 10 years ago. Back in the early 90s, it was 15% higher. Now it's about 5% lower than world's GDP. So again, the region has been losing ground as compared to other economies in the world. And that despite the fact that in terms of macro policy, there's been improvements. Actually, when you see here, for instance, inflation, the red line is Latin America. The other is, I mean, the light blue is the world, then the US and major advanced economies. Latin America has an inflation rate, have to be clear here. I'm excluding Venezuela and Argentina. Argentina is trying to fix this, but definitely, I mean, it could be somewhat higher if we include both. But you see, most of the countries have an inflation rate which is not that different from world's averages. So if you think of inflation, of monetary policy, of institutions regarding monetary policy, you see in most countries, they're doing a good job, a relatively good job. Okay. When you see some particular countries, here I have Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Brazil, and Peru, you see that they more or less have the same pattern as inflation in other parts of the world. Low inflation before the pandemic, then an increase in inflation, a significant increase in inflation after the pandemic, and then inflation has been coming down in some countries more rapidly than in others, but it's sort of closing the gap with the rest of the world. The inflation target in Latin America is about 3%, and the rest in advanced economies is 2%. So you might expect a 1% gap, and that's more or less what you see that even it's happening or will happen relatively soon. When you see monetary policy, what's happened with monetary policy, you see that again, you see a pattern which is not that different from what we saw in other parts of the world. Latin America was faster, did it early, increased rates when inflation was going up, increased quite significantly the monetary policy rate, but all countries have been cutting rates, some more aggressively than others, but they all go in the same direction, in the direction of reducing monetary policy rates. So again, what I'm trying to say is that in terms of monetary policy inflation, the region has performed relatively well with the two exceptions that I mentioned you before. What has happened with fiscal? In this period, in the previous period of low interest rates, public debt has increased quite significantly all over the world. It's been particularly relevant, for instance, in this country, the USA. In the USA, huge increase in public debt. Here you see, for instance, the euro area, the US is the blue line, major advanced economies is the purple line. And here you see Latin America, the red line. Emerging market and developing economies is the light blue line. What has happened in terms of public debt? In Latin America, it has increased, but not that much. And actually, it's relatively low as compared to other parts of the world. I'm not saying, I want to be clear, remember, Latin America might be very heterogeneous, that there are countries with fiscal problems, but in general terms, on average, I would say that fiscal as monetary have performed relatively well in this region of the world. So if we have improved macro policies, what has happened? That the economy as a whole has performed extremely poor. Well, basically, what I'm trying to say is that politics, public policies, institutions have deteriorated quite significantly. Let's go to that part. Here you see this is a map on an index of democracy. This is the one produced by The Economist. There are many others, okay? And you can see that the democracy level during the last 10 years in the region has declined, and very significantly in some cases. The only countries that are considered full democracies or close to full democracies are Chile, which is somewhat below that level, but it's 7.98, so it's close to 8, which is the level of full democracy, and Uruguay. But look at the rest. Look at the biggest economies of the region. Mexico has gone from 691 to 514. Brazil from 712 to 668. Argentina from 684 to 662. Peru, a significant decline. So what we see here is a decline in the level of democracy. And that's very much related, I would argue, with the deterioration of politics and public policies. Now, to be clear, the decline in democracy, or the fragile state of democracy, it's not only a phenomenon of Latin America, it's a global phenomenon. Here you see countries declining and countries advancing, and you see more countries declining than advancing. But this is, in any case, it's very clear in the case of Latin America. There you see corruption. The more red the map, the more corrupted the country. I don't know how you see this, but I see it pretty red. So corruption has been a big problem, a big issue for Latin America. But it's even gotten worse over the last decade. Look at some countries. Well, the only countries that are not corrupt in this, at least in this index, are Uruguay and Chile. Uruguay has remained the same with 73, but Chile has declined from 71 to 66. It's still in yellow, but it's deteriorated. Mexico went from 34, a very low level or very high level of corruption, 31. Brazil from 42 to 36. Peru again from 38 to 33, etc. So you see a deterioration in corruption levels in the region. Economic freedom, institutions. This is very much related to different institutions. Again, you see that there are only 2 countries here 10 years ago that were considered free or mostly free, Chile and Colombia. The level of Chile has declined, still considered mostly free. Colombia went from mostly free to 59, so mostly moderate, mostly unfree, right? Mostly unfree. But again, Mexico from 68 to 66 to 62, Brazil from 57 to 53, etc. Again, a deterioration in the index of economic freedom of the region, and very much across the board. We have another problem, another big problem in the region, which is crime. I'm talking not only about homicide rate. This is a graph on homicide rate per 1,000 people, which is the usual index that is used to measure or to compare different countries. Latin America is by far the region of the world with the highest homicide rate. Actually, according to the IMF, about half of total homicides in the world take place in Latin America, with only 8% of the population. We all know, and there are many studies on that, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later on, that show that crime, organized crime, etc., reduce investment, productivity, and finally, growth. They have a significant effect on economic growth. They delay investment, they make more fragile property rights, reduce the time horizon of investment, etc. When you ask people in the region what is the top of mind concern, they would tell you, in most countries, violence, crime. Here I see different countries, which we see very high rates of crime. Actually, there are sort of 2 groups. These ones here with that are Brazil, Mexico, and well, now Ecuador and Colombia, and the ones here that have lower rates, but still relatively high. And in particularly, one country that concerns me the most is Chile. Chile used to have a crime rate of 3 per 100,000 inhabitants. It was the lowest in the region by far. In the Americas was the lowest, the second lowest only to Canada. And now it's increased from 3 to 6. And it's a top of mind concern of the population. I put there, just a bit provoking, El Salvador. Because actually, they've been successful in terms of reducing crime. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Now, but at what cost? A cost of reducing democracy, reducing liberties, political liberties. So I could say that the challenge of the region is to reduce crime, but keeping the degrees of democracy not affecting public liberties. And I see this with concern because I work in Chile in an institution, in a think tank that produces surveys. And you can't imagine how has changed, how has increased the share of the population that is willing to sacrifice public liberties for a reduction in crime. In other words, how Bukele is becoming a sort of role model. And that, at least for me, is a big concern, particularly, and let's be clear on this, in the poor neighborhoods. So if the political class doesn't address this issue, we definitely have a problem. So what are the perspectives? I mean, Latin America has been growing at low rates. What can we expect for the future? Here I have projections made by the IMF until 2029. Of course, these are projections. This might not happen. But this is the way the world and some experts see Latin America versus the rest of the world in terms of growth. And what can we see? The red is Latin America, the light blue is the world, the orange is emerging market and developing economies. What this slide shows is that Latin America could keep growing at lower rates than the rest of the world. So if this is true, this happens to be true, Latin America will keep losing ground related to the world economy. This is a graph that shows growth projections for the next 5 years. These were projections in 2014, the World Economic Outlook, IMF. So these were the projections for 2014, 2018. And the projections for 2024, 2028. Look at what's happened in the region. In 2014, there were many high performers, and they were expected to grow. Look, Peru, close to 6%. Chile, close to 5%, the same as Colombia. Latin America as a whole, not that much, but 3 and something percent. What has happened now? What are the projections? Well, that Peru will grow 2.2%, Chile about the same, Colombia 3%, much lower. Now, it is true that these projections show that all emerging markets and developing economies will grow less than what it was projected 10 years ago. But still, in the case of Latin America, is particularly low. So projections for the region do not seem good. And what's been the big difference in terms of growth in our region, in Latin America, versus other emerging market economies? Here I have emerging market Europe, emerging market Asia. This is something that you probably know perfectly well. But what we've seen is basically, the difference, if we decompose growth, it's not labor, which actually the demographic transition has been much worse in Eastern Europe, and not that different from Asia in the case of Latin America. But we see that capital accumulation is much lower in the case of Latin America than in the case of the rest of the world. But particularly, the big difference is regarding TFP, productivity. So, when we compare Latin America with other emerging market economies, what do we see? A very low increase in productivity. And that, of course, is a major issue. Now, so far, this has been a very bleak picture. Too much for bad news. Let's start to have some, I wouldn't say positive news, but at least some hope regarding the region. What can change all this? Are there any reasons to think that the future will be better than the past? Well, I'm moderately optimistic. I think that there are some opportunities that the region has that if we take advantage of them, we can sort of change at least part of the picture that I've shown before. Some of them are opportunities, some of them are simply challenges. Challenges given the descriptions of the problem that I made earlier. And perhaps the most important is the energy transition. And I would say there are two factors regarding the energy transition in which Latin America has comparative advantages. The first one is this. the energy transition metals. The energy transition metals are those metals that are being used for the energy transition. This has not to do with the production of those metals, but metals that are used for the energy transition, like copper, nickel, like lithium, etc. Okay, and what we see, these are projections through 2050. We see that the demand for these metals will increase quite significantly over the next 30 years. That is, those are the blue bars, and they are measured here in the left-hand side axis. The right-hand side axis measures this line, this orange line, and what it shows is the difference between the expected demand and the expected supply. So if you have in one metal 1, it means that the expected, one here in this axis, that the expected supply is supposed to increase at the same rate as the expected demand. And what you see here is that in most cases, not in all, demand will increase much faster than supply. What does it mean? It means that most likely the price of these commodities will increase. And the countries that produce these commodities will benefit from that. Latin America, as you know, is a resource region. And when we see the reserves of energy transition metals by region, we see that Latin America, which is the light blue one, has a disproportionate share of the reserves of this metal. Okay. So definitely here there is an opportunity for the region. By the way, the other region that has a disproportionate share also is this one here, which is Australia and Pacific. Okay. Again, we do have an opportunity regarding this energy transition process. The other thing which is quite interesting is how Latin America has advanced in the change of electricity productions towards renewables. Here we have the world, Latin America, and I put 2 countries, Brazil and Chile, 2013, 2023. Look at what happened during the last 10 years. Actually, Latin America, more than 60% of total energy production comes from renewables, and 19% of that from non-conventional renewables, mostly solar and wind. Okay, that compared with the world, which is only 30%, and America is more than 60%. Here you see Brazil and Chile. Look at Chile, which is my own country, has more than 60% of renewables, and 32% of that non-conventional renewable. By non-conventional, again, we mean basically solar and wind. And it is expected that by 2030, this 32% becomes something like 65 or 70%. So again, in that sense, the energy transition in this country has gone faster than in the rest of the world, and I see that as an opportunity. The other one is more of a challenge: crime reduction. Crime has penetrated in the region, as I mentioned you before, quite significantly. And we all know the effects of that in terms of investment, productivity, and growth. There's this study by the IMF in which they basically, they make a very detailed research, and they basically find that if the region security gap goes to the world average, by security gap I mean the reduction in crimes, go to the world average, growth for the whole region could increase in 0.5 percentage points, and that's huge. So there's a big challenge here in terms of crime reduction. It can bolster growth significantly. Is that easy? I don't think it's easy. but it is feasible. It can be done. Finally, regarding productivity, let me talk about a couple of things, GFP and human capital. This is a graph that shows how good Latin America's GDP be if we would have had the productivity of Asia, or the human capital, the increasing human capital of Asia, or capitals as in Asia. And you see that in all cases, GDP would be much higher than what it is now. But this is simply to show that the biggest difference here is this: total factor productivity. Okay? The biggest difference, the biggest problem of the region is total factor productivity. And let me give you an example, which is related to my own country, which is related to Chile. I was a member last year and this year actually of this commission that set up the current government on productivity, potential growth, and fiscal space. Basically, trying to look at what were the factors which could enhance productivity, potential growth, and then fiscal space, because there's a lack of fiscal space in the case of Chile. And it called former central bankers, former Minister of Finance, and there was a group of 7 economists that we worked on this issue. We worked on many issues, actually, but one of the things that we focused was on bureaucracy. How had changed bureaucracy over the last decade? And in particularly, more detailed, how had permits, the time you need to make an investment, changed over the last decade? How much extra time you needed to get a permit, so to make an investment? And we found basically that the time, this bureaucratic time, had increased by a factor of 3. And that's basically, or mostly, bureaucracy. So we made some exercises, and one of the exercises was, what happens if we reduce the time needed to get the permits to make an investment by 1/3 or by 2/3? If we reduce it by 2/3, it means that we go back to the levels that we had 10 years ago. And that could boost productivity in about 0.5 percentage points. So there you have another factor that could increase growth in a significantly. So let me finish, because we cannot talk about growth if we don't talk about human capital. Saying a couple of words regarding human capital. If you see, this is a graph in which you have here per capita GDP and average years of schooling. And I'm not going to go in detail into this, but you see most that Latin America countries have an average year of schooling which is not that different from other countries that have similar per capita income. So the problem doesn't seem to be here. It doesn't seem to be in the quantity of the education. Rather, it seems to be here, which is the quality of education. Here is the fraction of enrolled students in secondary education not reaching basic skills. And you see that Latin America is the second worst, only to sub-Saharan Africa. Much worse. This is 60% don't reach basic skills. Much worse than Central Asia, East Asia, Europe, and of course North America. So we do have a problem regarding the quality of education. We're not going to details because I think I'm on time, but in summary, the overall performance of the region has been quite poor over the last decade, over actually the last many decades. There are modest growth projections, so the near future doesn't seem very good. We have persistent productivity challenges, though macro policy in general seems okay. Not perfect, but okay. Beyond macro, we see a deterioration of institutions and public policies. Crime is a major issue in the region, and there are no standout performers in the region, as we had let's say 10 years ago. For instance, my own country, Chile, went from the poster child of the region to a low growth country. Politics in general is very dysfunctional and polarized. Challenges and opportunities, I mentioned three, maybe many more: energy transition, reduction in crime, productivity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rodrigo. I'm going to ask a question to get us started, then we'll go to the audience. So have your questions ready and we'll pass the mic. We'll also get at least one from online. I want to dig in a little bit. You mentioned that the region as a whole isn't doing well, and you seem to connect that both with reduced levels of democracy and increased levels of corruption. And I want to press on that a little bit. I looked up China's democracy score on the Economist Intelligence Unit, which I think is the scale that you used, or the metric that you used. China was 156 of 167 countries in 2022, and they seem to do pretty well economically. So how do you address that? That's number one. And number two, you mentioned increased levels of corruption. I think there's a pretty sizable body of work showing that some types of corruption actually help economic growth. So do all types of corruption hurt economic growth? You mentioned later in your talk that you wanted to reduce time to make investments. So how do you think about the connections between corruption and economic growth and democracy and economic growth? If you could address that for a few minutes, that'd be great. And then we'll go to the audience.
Thank you very much, Dan. I guess it is not a surprise that you asked me about China, because Dan, as you know, is an expert on China. I mean, you're right. I mean, definitely China is not a democratic country. And actually, you know more than me about this. But if I had to think of China now, I would say that now it's less democratic than some years ago. But definitely, I mean, what would be the answer to that? I mean, this is a multifactorial problem. It's not only democracy. I can't think of, I mean, by the way, you can think of many other countries which have not had democratic governments and have prospered in terms of economics. Singapore at the time, Korea, not now, but some years ago. So yeah, I mean, actually, Bob Barrow has a paper on that in which he shows that it's not necessarily related one to another. So I agree. I mean, you might have a government with a non-democratic government that does well, that performs well in economic terms. But if that goes with corruption, with poor public policies, with low investment, etc., then that could affect economic performance. I could say that on average, this is always an average. We have two regressions, and regressions are on average. On average, I would say that you find that the more prosperous countries are in general more democratic. Now, corruption, it's kind of difficult for me to think of corruption as something good for growth. Again, you can have some very corrupt countries that do well. But again, this is a multifactorial problem. I could say that if you have more corruption, if you have more time for permits, if you have to bribe your public officials to get permits, I mean, that's going to deter investment, and that's finally going to reduce growth. But I mean, those are very two good questions. Again, you have averages, and you always have outliers.
Excellent. Thank you, Rodrigo. So we're going to do questions from the audience. Please identify yourself. We'll start right here.
Hi, thank you very much, Rodrigo and the Romani Mosavar Center. I'm Jose Ignacio from the MPAD program, second year. Rodrigo, in your diagnostic, you put a lot of emphasis at the beginning on this change in institutions, for example, in democracy in the region. And then the challenges and opportunities are basically on the productivity side, on the crime. My question is, if, for example, political reforms, there's a lot of debate that in Chile, also Peru had a lot of political problems, Ecuador. If there is, so if these problems are caused by these institutional problems, or like, for example, like crime and productivity, or is the other way around? So the institutions, the political institutions are reflecting a problem, but there is no, like, you should not go forward and try to like fix the institutional, the political institutions, because are reflecting a problem and they are not the cause of the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a very important question. And the answer is probably both. But I would say that, I mean, at least from my experience, or from the experience of the country that I know the best, which is Chile, it's basically politics deteriorates public policies and political and institutions. We had, in our case, a political reform back in 2014. We had a majority system. This is a presidential system. We had a majority system in which were basically two big coalitions. And these two coalitions had shared the center left and the center right. It had been in power mostly the center left, but center right also had been in power for one term. These two big coalitions got together, had agreements, and they sort of, this was after the return of democracy, and public policies, I would say, were very good. And growth was high, and the country was prospering. In 2014, there was this idea that this majority systems would hurt smaller parties, which is true. I mean, so we wanted to have a proportional system. And we moved towards a proportional system. The fact of the matter is that now we have 22 parties in Congress, and they can't get agreement on almost anything. If you ask me whether this was a good reform, I think it was a lousy reform. Now they want to change it again. They are thinking of changing it, but it's not easy because, I mean, when you have small parties that sort of make the difference, I mean, they have a lot of power and they don't want to change. They don't want to move back to the previous system. I mean, they exist, they have 2-3% of the vote. And in the reform proposal, it is something that says, I mean, if you don't have 5%, then you won't be in Congress, such as in Germany. That is the case in Germany. But if I have 2% of the vote, and I'm very decisive in many important issues, I don't want to change that. And they don't want to change that, so I'm not sure whether that reform will pass, but that's a very important reform. So I would say that at least, I don't know that much of many other countries, but at least in the case of my country, a political reform, an electoral reform actually, of that sort is badly needed. Probably is the first reform that we should have.
Thank you, Rodrigo. We're going to go to a question from our online audience, and then we'll come back to the in-person audience.
This is from David Mizrachi, who is an attorney in Panama and a senior fellow at the Mosa Baramani Center. Do you think the increase in investor-state dispute settlement registrations at ICSID against Latin American sovereigns are impacting the levels of foreign direct investment in Latin America?
Definitely, yes. I would say that they are. And that, again, has to do with politics, with the political system, with public policies, in which sometimes you deter FDI. It used to be the case in no distant past that you would promote FDI. Now, in many countries, again, there's a lot of heterogeneity here. Many countries, what you do, you change, for instance, you change regulation, because many of FDI is in regulated sectors, and you change regulation discretionally. In some cases, it might be good to do that. I mean, be perfectly right. I mean, you have a problem, you have to change regulation. But there are many cases, which I know of, in which you basically change regulation because you want a bigger share for the state. Just simply for that. So you change the rules. And if you change the rules, then you're subject to litigation. And if you're subject to litigation, then new companies that want to invest in your country know that there's a risk. There's a risk that they might change the rules which you are using to evaluate your project. So yeah, I mean, the answer to that question is definitely, I think that this has been increasing, and definitely it affects investment.
All right, we had a question at the end of the second row here.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Danya. I'm a first-year MPP student. My question is specifically related to the energy transition. So one of the issues with countries that are now looking to invest in renewable energy infrastructure in general, is the timeline of these projects. They're at minimum, sometimes 8 to 10 years, sometimes more. What are the measures that governments in Latin America can put in place to not only attract investment in the first place, but help ensure that their investments are actually seen through?
That's a very important point, because when I mentioned that Latin America has an opportunity here, we have to seize that opportunity. And one of the reasons that I'm afraid of, or which concerns me, is precisely the issue that you raised. I mean, will we? I would say help. I mean, we welcome these new investments. Will we give them the permits they need, because they need a lot of permits, which is reasonable to get permits in due time? Will we accompany these firms in the process of investing? Look, in the south of Chile, there are projects for about $100 billion projects. I mean, this is theory. If we move well and move fast, there might be a huge boom. But it depends very much on governments and on local authorities. What we have to do, we should, fortunately, I would say that some governments are sort of realizing that there is a problem here. So they are concerned about this issue, and they are moving towards helping to carry out these investments. I mean, to give the conditions that they invest. But I don't know. I would like to be very optimistic on this. I'm a bit skeptical. I mean, it's not been the case, at least in the last decade.
All right, we got a question right here.
Thank you. My name is Pablo. I'm from the MPAD program. Rodrigo, it's always a pleasure to hear from you. At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that macroeconomic policy in the region is like getting better. Economic growth is decreasing, and politics is decreasing, right? How is it possible that the decrease in the politics quality is impacting only economic growth and not impacting the macroeconomic policy?
Again, a very good question. Let me give you a couple of ideas here. It was so bad, macro policies back in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, that this sort of consensus that you cannot mess with that again. Okay, so many countries have institutions such as independent central banks that sort of keep inflation in check. And governments, so far, are not willing to intervene. The central bank are very much okay with maintaining the independence. Perhaps the most interesting case that I see is Peru. Are there any Peruvians here? No? Peru has Julio Velarde. Julio Velarde is the head of the central bank. Julio Velarde has been there for many, many years. Actually, I was head of the Central Bank of Chile, and Julio Velarde was there. He was with my predecessor, with the predecessor of my predecessor, with the person that succeeded me, etc. He's been there for many, many years. And every government that comes to power says, okay, I want to change things, but I don't want to change Julio Velarde. So they want to keep, because they know that he's a warranty that inflation will be kept in check. That's not, in my view, I mean, it's great that he's here. It's great that inflation is low. that's not the best institutional arrangement. I mean, to depend on one person. But, well, that at least shows you that governments are not, the same happens in the case of Chile. I mean, there's rotation of, there be many governors of the central bank there, but the government understands that there's an independent central bank, and the objective is inflation. Second, well, Brazil is another interesting case. You know, Lula's been at odds with the current governor of the central bank. The government leaves now in December, and well, but still, I mean, actually, it's interesting. I will show how central banks are cutting rates. In the case of Brazil, having just the opposite, increased rates, despite the opposition of Lula, of the president of Brazil. The second, I would say there's more consciousness in the population about the harm of inflation. So they are okay with that. No, I don't see politicians really trying to mess up with central banks. On the other hand, fiscal is more complicated because as the economy grows at low rates, there's of course the temptation to increase government spending to boost the economy. And there are some countries in the region that have gone to high budget deficit. Again, Brazil is one of them. There are not many of them. I would say that's until now, at least fiscal has been very responsible. But I tend to agree, I guess, with your question in the sense that if growth remains low for longer, there's a risk that macro policy deteriorate. So yeah.
All right, we had a question in the back.
So, hi everyone. Thanks, Rodrigo, for the presentation. My name is Daniel. I'm an MPA from Brazil, and my questions regard the framework that you presented. In terms that it's clear that for the human capital, like quality of education and also easiness to the business, there are levers that the national governments can actually deploy. When you go to the criminality aspect, when you show, we clearly see that the top countries, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, they all are influenced by the drug trade. And this is a global issue that maybe the negative effects are more concentrated into those countries. So my question for you, I don't want to delve into the policy issues of drug trade, but what is the role that Latin America can play into the international arena so we can solve these issues that are not necessarily only local, but badly influences our position?
So I guess your question, that's a very good, I guess your question is, Latin America has a supply, the world has a demand. What can we do, in the international arena to, talk to the consumers of the countries that have the consumption, so as to do something together? I mean, there are always international forums on this, and you could talk to some developed economies, which are the main consumers of drugs all over the world. But I'm a bit skeptical about the success of those types of. I mean, I wish they were successful. Okay, that would be the best for everybody. But I really think that this is a problem at the end that we have to solve in our countries. This is an issue that affects us. Of course, it has origins everywhere in other parts of the world. But at the end, if we wait for sort of big agreements among, in the United Nations, so those type of places, we will die waiting. Okay, so I don't know. I wish I were more optimistic regarding this.
All right, we're going to take one final question in the middle of this third row. Yes.
Thank you so much. It's an honor. I'm Sam. I'm a second-year MPP student. So thank you so much again for the presentation. You mentioned three factors that contributed to the declining productivity in the region: increasing or deteriorating political institutions, increasing bureaucracy, and the lack of quality education. But I kind of want to ask, take a step further in asking, why are we seeing these trends across the entire region uniformly? We're talking about dozens of countries. So I would be curious about how do you explain this broad trend that's happening in the region? What are the underlying political, socioeconomic factors that are leading to these broad changes?
I mentioned three factors, but I don't think that there are only three factors. There are many factors. Okay, I just mentioned three because I have a limited period of time. That's a very interesting question. Why Latin America as a whole is doing so poorly? I mean, why there are no exceptions? I could say, are there common factors? Yeah, I mean, the common factors are basically the issues that I mentioned, and then you also mentioned. I mean, bad politics, corruption, that's related to also crime, drug trafficking, which is something which in Latin America has, of course, comparative advantages producing drugs. Okay, but I also have to mention this. That's not always been the case. So it's not that we're condemned to either grow more or grow less altogether. I mentioned you before, there was a period in which countries such as Chile, for instance, had high rates of growth, 5% during 30 years. There was a period in which Peru grew at very high rates. There was a period in which Colombia grew at very high rates. There was a period in the past, in the 1960s, in which Brazil had very high rates of growth. So yeah, I tried to put here common factors, but I also said that there is heterogeneity, and we're not condemned to do all the same mistakes, at the same time. So you might have exceptions here. Actually, you have some exceptions, some small countries exceptions. Now we're in a period in which all countries are performing bad, but it's not been the case always, and it's not been the case over the last 3 or 4 decades.
Rodrigo, it's been a masterclass on the economies of Latin America. I can't thank you enough on behalf of MRCBG and on behalf of our audience here, on behalf of our audience online, for sharing your insights with us today. I know we had a whole number of questions that weren't answered. So if you're available, I hope I don't put you on the hook by asking you to stay around for a few minutes afterwards to respond to some questions in small groups or one-on-one. But please join me in thanking Dr. Rodrigo Vergara.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan.